February 1973. An alley behind 68th Street and Union Avenue on the south side of Chicago. A car pulls up. A few seconds later, shots. 6 to the head, 1 to the arm. The body of a 19-year-old named William Young collapses into the cold. The man who ordered those shots will never walk free again. He will spend the next 5 decades in a cell. But here is the part nobody expected. Prison did not shrink Larry Hoover. It made him more powerful than he ever was on the street. He built an organization worth $100 million a year. He launched a political movement. He became a symbol. And even now, after more than 50 years behind bars, America still cannot settle the most basic question about him. Was he redeemed, or did he simply learn to speak a different language for the same kind of power? That question has no clean answer. And the reason it has no clean answer is the reason this story will not let Chicago go. Larry Hoover was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1950, and by the time he was 4 years old, his family had joined the Great Migration north. They landed in Englewood on Chicago's south side, a neighborhood that was already starting to buckle under the weight of poverty, overcrowding, and the slow withdrawal of city services that would define it for decades. By 13, Hoover had dropped out of junior high and joined a local street gang called the Supreme Gangsters. He was small, quick, and according to people who knew him then, unusually smart about how groups worked. By the time he was 15, the gang's original leader had been murdered, and Hoover stepped into the vacuum. He was a teenager running a crew of more than 1,000. That would have been a remarkable story on its own. But Hoover had a talent that most street leaders did not. He understood alliances. In 1969, he did something that shocked everyone on the South Side. He sat down with David Barksdale, the leader of the Black Disciples, the gang the Supreme Gangsters had been at war with for years, and proposed a merger. Barksdale agreed. The result was the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Hoover was the chairman. Barksdale was the king. Together, they controlled a massive stretch of Chicago's South Side. The fighting between their factions did not disappear overnight, but the merger gave them something more valuable than peace. It gave them scale. And then Hoover threw it away with a single order. In February of 1973, a 19-year-old named William Young was accused of robbing one of Hoover's drug houses. Hoover called a meeting of about 10 members and ordered Young's execution, along with 3 others. On the night of February 26th, Young was brought to an alley in Englewood and shot. 6 bullets to the head. A key witness, Joshua Shaw, survived a related attack and testified against Hoover at a preliminary hearing. But before the trial began, Shaw was found dead in another alley, 2 shots to the back of his neck. His earlier testimony was admitted anyway. In December of 1973, Hoover was sentenced to 150 to 200 years in the Illinois state prison system. He was 23 years old. By every normal measure, his story was over. Except it was not even close. Hoover was sent to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, one of the toughest maximum security prisons in the state. And within months, something started happening that no one outside the walls fully understood until it was far too late. The man they had locked up to stop started building. In 1974, David Barksdale died of kidney failure from injuries he sustained in an assassination attempt 4 years earlier. That left Hoover as the sole leader of the entire Black Gangster Disciple Nation. He was running it from behind bars. By 1978, Hoover had gone further. He organized the Folk Nation, a massive alliance of street and prison gangs under his umbrella. Latin Disciples, Spanish Gangster Disciples, Simon City Royals, Satan Disciples, a dozen more. All answering, at least in theory, to a man sitting in a state prison cell. But the Folk Nation was just the architecture. The real engine was drugs. As crack cocaine swept through American cities in the 1980s, the Gangster Disciples were positioned to profit from it on a scale that most street gangs could not imagine. Federal prosecutors would later allege that the organization had 30,000 members across 35 states, pulling in $100 million a year. And the money flowed upward. Hoover sat at the top of a pyramid structure with governors, board members, and enforcers beneath him, each with defined territories, weekly dues, and strict rules about discipline. How do you run that kind of empire from a cell? The answer was simple and brutal. Hoover had more than 5,000 gangster disciples inside the Illinois prison system. They were loyal. They enforced his orders internally, and the men who got out carried those orders to the streets. If someone disobeyed, they were beaten. If someone stole, they disappeared. The phrase prison officials used was that Hoover turned incarceration into infrastructure. He was not free. But in terms of raw power, he may have been more dangerous locked up than he ever was on the street. Because the street gave him enemies. Prison gave him an army that had nowhere else to go. And then, in the early 1990s, something shifted, or at least it appeared to. By 1993, Larry Hoover announced that the initials GD no longer stood for Gangster Disciples. They stood for Growth and Development. He told his followers to go to school, learn trades, develop skills. He cited the biography of Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley, who rose from the rough-and-tumble Hamburg Athletic Club to become one of the most powerful political bosses in American history. Hoover saw himself on the same trajectory. Not crime, politics. And the results on the surface were remarkable. Growth and Development launched a political arm called 21st Century Vote. It organized voter registration drives across Englewood and the South Side. Thousands of young men who had never engaged with the system were suddenly showing up at City Hall protests, demanding that the city keep healthcare clinics open in black neighborhoods. There were food drives, school supply giveaways, community barbecues. 2 candidates with ties to Hoover ran for alderman. They lost, but the fact that they ran at all sent a chill through Chicago politics. Hoover was rewarded with a transfer to a minimum security facility in Vienna, Illinois, where conditions were nothing like Stateville. He wore new clothes. He had expensive jewelry. He ate specially prepared meals. He took private visits from friends, family, and political allies. A local newspaper called him an urban political celebrity. If you enjoy stories where the obvious explanation starts to crack under pressure, hit subscribe. Because the version of Larry Hoover that Chicago saw in the 1990s was about to collide with the version the federal government had been quietly building for years. And the collision was devastating. The thing about Hoover's transformation is that the federal government never believed it. Not for a second. In 1989, while Hoover was still in state prison, a joint investigation involving the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the Illinois Department of Corrections had already begun. It was called Operation Headache, and it would run for 6 years. The investigators had a problem. Hoover was careful. He did not discuss business on monitored phone lines. He spoke in code. He used intermediaries. So, in 1993, authorities got a judge's permission to try something unusual. They placed tiny recording devices inside the visitor badges given to gang leaders who came to see Hoover in person. The conversations they captured painted a very different picture from growth and development. According to prosecutors, Hoover was still issuing orders: drug distribution, financial kickbacks, territorial enforcement. The nonprofits, the voter registration drives, the charity concerts, all of it, prosecutors alleged, was a front for laundering drug money. Informants testified that none of the proceeds from the so-called charities actually went to anyone in need. On August 31, 1995, federal agents swept in. 39 high-ranking gangster disciples were indicted in a single day. Hoover was arrested at the Vienna Correctional Center and moved to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago to stand trial. The indictment ran to 50 counts: conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, continuing criminal enterprise. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that the gangster disciples generated $109 million a year in drug revenue. They showed organizational charts recovered from raids. They played wiretap recordings. One of the people convicted was Sonia Irwin, a former officer with the Chicago Police Department's Gang Crimes Unit, who had become involved with a senior gang leader. In 1997, Hoover was found guilty on all 40 counts. The judge, Harry Leinenweber, called him one of the most notorious criminals in Illinois history. Lead prosecutor Ron Safer drew a comparison to Al Capone and said Hoover had misused a God-given gift for leadership. The sentence was 6 additional life terms, and this time there would be no minimum security transfer. Hoover was sent to ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, the most restrictive prison in the United States. A 7 by 12-foot concrete cell, 23 hours a day in isolation. No more visitors with bugged badges because there were almost no visitors at all. Here is the question that Chicago has been arguing about ever since, and it is worth thinking about before you move on. Was Larry Hoover genuinely trying to transform the gangster disciples into a legitimate political force, and the feds crushed him because a powerful black political organization in Chicago scared the establishment? Or was growth and development always a mask, a brilliant piece of public relations designed to get Hoover out of prison so he could run his empire without restrictions? The evidence supports both readings, which is exactly why this case still generates heat 30 years later. If you have your own verdict, leave it below. For a channel like this, a real argument is worth far more than a thumbs up. But there is one more chapter to this story, and it is the strangest one yet. For a long time after his transfer to ADX Florence, Larry Hoover faded from public view. He was in the most isolated prison in the country. The gangster disciples splintered. Leadership on the streets fractured. Violence surged in some neighborhoods as rival factions fought for control. But Hoover's name did not disappear. It migrated into a place the criminal justice system could not reach: culture. In 2010, Rick Ross released a track that opened with the line about thinking he was Big Meech and Larry Hoover. The name became shorthand for a kind of mythological street power. And then Kanye West, a fellow Chicago native, took the cause further than anyone expected. In October of 2018, West walked into the Oval Office and sat down with Donald Trump. He told the president that Hoover was a man who had been turning his life around and that the government had punished him for it. West said Hoover had started doing positive things for the community, and as soon as he showed real power, they hit him with 6 life sentences. Trump, by most accounts, did not seem to know who Hoover was. 3 years later, in December of 2021, West and Drake, 2 of the biggest names in music who had been publicly feuding, set aside their rivalry for a single cause. They headlined a free Larry Hoover benefit concert at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, streamed live on Amazon Prime. The message was clear. This was no longer just a Chicago story. It was a national conversation about justice, redemption, and whether a man could serve long enough to earn a second chance. And then, on May 28, 2025, Trump acted. He commuted all 6 of Hoover's federal life sentences, reducing them to time served. But Larry Hoover did not walk free. He could not. His federal sentence was only half the equation. He still owed 150 to 200 years on the state murder conviction from 1973. He was transferred out of ADX Florence and back into the Illinois state prison system. His attorneys immediately petitioned Governor Pritzker for clemency. His son told reporters that his father had suffered multiple heart attacks in custody and that all he wanted was to come home and spend whatever time he had left with his family. The former lead prosecutor, Ron Safer, said he believed in redemption and mercy, but that some crimes are so breathtakingly evil that the justice system requires full punishment. As of now, Larry Hoover remains in prison. He is 75 years old. He has been locked up for more than half a century. And the argument about what he represents has not moved an inch. For stories where the answer keeps shifting depending on where you stand, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is a case where the final chapter has not been written yet. But step back to where this started. An alley behind 68th and Union, February 1973. A 19-year-old named William Young lies dead in the cold, 6 bullets in his head. No one held a concert for him. No rapper said his name in the Oval Office. No president commuted anything on his behalf. Larry Hoover built an empire. He may have changed. He may not have. People will argue about it for as long as Chicago remembers his name. But the body in the alley is still there, in the court record, in the memory of a family that never got a benefit concert. That is the part of the story that does not shift depending on where you stand. That part stays exactly where it fell.